Hi, my name's Janice Switlo. About a year ago, during my presentation at the Treaty Law School, I promised to release a series of web releases discussing important issues in Indigenous matters. And to that end, of course, life gets in the way, lots of phone calls, lots of emergencies, so I apologize for those who have been waiting on this. Now, I have more than 50 subjects already prepared and had planned to introduce this series in a fairly consecutive order. But given the current state of affairs and given what the last couple of weeks has exposed to me is actually going on, I'm putting that aside. My next broadcast will do a proper introduction. But today I need to inform you as to what is actually underway by Canada, the provinces, and how that pertains to your nationality as an Indigenous national. Now, first, I want to do a special shout out to Cackling Cactus Curiosities for allowing me to use this store for this web series. It's a great store for trading card games, collectibles, anime, and all things geek. And they also offer their store for open gaming events like Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering, and private gaming use without charge, believing strongly in community. So I'm indebted to their assistance in allowing me their premises to speak to you today. Now, as I indicated, I had hoped to have this series really begin to explain some terms, easy chunks of information. But I'm going to delay that and speak to you today about exactly what are these framework arrangements being put in place. No one really knows because they're dealt with confidentially at tables. The people aren't given copies of anything, don't really know what's going on. It's all a lot of innuendo. But fortunately, I have been provided with documents that have allowed me to now share with you exactly what is going on. So, I'm speaking to you from British Columbia, where I actually first got involved in matters by exposing the fact that the so-called BC treaty process is actually a land claims process. Significant difference because treaties are international documents, land claims are simply domestic agreements negotiated under federal policies. Now, it's important to note that the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who's been re-elected in a minority position, has confirmed, as has his other ministers, that there are no changes to the federal policies. It's important to appreciate that. Consistently, in BC, elders, now ancestors, have always demanded a treaty with the Crown. And it's a fair demand. This has also occurred elsewhere where treaties have not been completed, for example, quote unquote, in Ontario, Anishinaabe. Now, why is demanding an actual treaty a fair demand? Well, because the Crown is under something called a duty of fairness, and that means that the Crown must be consistent and deal equitably with the Indigenous nations consistently throughout the area. And since she engaged in and completed and is bound by treaties in the vast majority of the area that's considered Canada, she is equally bound by the duty of fairness to complete that task, to complete entering into treaties in British Columbia, for example, in Ontario and other areas that have not been completed. But the governments of the day, this is why I call Canada an outlaw nation, have chosen to, instead of facilitating that and instead of completing the obligations that through the self-government process that Canada itself received from the Crown, that includes being responsible financially, for example, for fulfilling treaties, they never have liked not having full capacity here. They've not liked the idea of the Crown having permissions only from Indigenous nations to exercise partial political sovereignty. They prefer to have full Crown sovereignty here. Why? Because under a constitutional monarchy, which the self-government process has proceeded for Canada, a constitutional monarch has to act on the advice of the elected members who form her Privy Council. This means that whatever the Crown holds here, then the elected government can control, exercise, and benefit from. So having merely an ability to be present and use land from a higher entity that actually still owns the land, which is acknowledged in all of the treaties entered into, and I can get into that in other webcasts where I will explain to you where exactly in the treaties these items and these boilerplate legal terms are and what they mean, that many people are confused about. So getting back to the duty of fairness, what they first did, and one of the first things that I became very public about, was revealing, as I mentioned, that the BC treaty process was not in fact a treaty process, but is a land claims process. And as a result of extensive writing, and I've done that for decades now, it's not been as popular a concept, and few deals have been done under the BC treaty process. So appreciating that it's still a hard sell because people have started to learn the truth about it, there's a new process in place. Before, with the BC treaty process, it started up with a Band Council resolution. They then proceeded to a framework agreement, and then it would have to go to an agreement in principle, which would be put to a vote by the people, and then a final land claim agreement, which was put to another vote. Throughout that whole process, it was relatively easy to say, well, people haven't approved this process. It's not actually a treaty. It's a misrepresentation. You're tricking them, hence my paper called Trick or Treaty. And so it has proven unsuccessful, and many millions of dollars have been sunk into this. And here's the interesting thing. Those dollars were often borrowed on the basis of a Band Council resolution. The people did not approve them. And so I pointed out as well is that the band doesn't own that debt. It's not their responsibility. It's not something Canada can take back or collect should the process not proceed. So now we have a different situation, because as I said, that wasn't working. And lots of flaws that I've pointed out, for example, as to why Canada and the provinces would not get what they purport to get. Now, however, we have this new framework approach. Again, remember, it's still the same federal policy. It's same policies in play. It's just another way. It's like lipstick on the pig. It's another way to do it. Here's how they're doing it. You'll get a chief signing in and agreeing to a framework agreement with Canada. A second agreement is done with the province. So using British Columbia's example, there is a second framework agreement with the province. Then there is a third document, which is an agreement to implement those two framework agreements. There is no voting through this process whatsoever. The people don't even have a clue what is being done. And here's the significant difference. If you look at that implementation agreement as I have, you'll see that there is absolutely nothing given from the provincial or federal side of things. Absolutely nothing. And it's very clear that there's no obligation to continue funding, that all funding is subject to appropriations, which means it has to be approved in a budget vote by elected members of Parliament or MLAs. So there's no independent requirement of funding those things. The parties can walk away at any time. And here's what's so critically different. It makes me emotional to think about it, so bear with me. And that is that these this implementation agreement sets out key representations by the chief, who purports to speak for the people, so ostensible authority, as you say, holds out and says, well, we are under, everything is done within the Constitution of Canada. Everything is done under the Section 35 doctrine. Everything is done on the basis that, and this is what those sections mean, you're not a nation. You're not entering into treaty. And specifically it says this is not a treaty and this is not a land claim. It is a representation by the people through its chief to say, yeah, we're already within Canada. So essentially, this is the key. That's a capitulation. That's the key representation that Canada and the provinces need in order to actually control what is actually still owned by Indigenous nations. Because they're saying, no, we don't own anything. And this is all done through a chief. No votes. But if you look at the thing that I was so suspicious about this past year, is how many bands are being told, oh, you need a new membership code. You need a new election code. You need a new constitutional code. These 3 key documents. And when I've been asked to look at some of these for some of the communities, consistently I have seen in there what's different. The previous ones worked fine, but what's different? A handing over of authority by the people to chief and council. So essentially saying, we don't need to vote on anything. We're handing it to you. And it's being done through these 3 documents. Because consistently what I have always said, why UNIDRIP does not bind nations, is why none of these things bind the people. Because they retain the power of decision making, and they have not, first of all, authorized these initiatives to be looked into and started, and they certainly have not authorized such representations. But now, because they've put these quote-unquote self-government pieces in place, again, new election codes, new membership codes, and new constitutions, and I'll get into later why a constitution is actually designed to break you from your actual nation and its actual thousands of years old constitution, the strongest and most powerful in the world. Those are for other times. But essentially, they're saying, well, you voted these things in and you agreed to hand off your decision making to the chief, who in turn is making these representations for you. So it's quite devious how they've done this. The people I know have no idea that this is what they have indirectly done. They have not done this with full information. They have not done this even in many cases with the capacity to understand what those little sections slipped in that are not necessary for an election code, that are not necessary for any of those pieces that were done, but were designed specifically to dovetail into this new framework setup. Now, this is not just happening in BC and Ontario where there are no treaties. This is also happening where there are treaties. For example, Treaty 1 to 11, where I've advised for years now. Why? Let's get back to the Crown duty of fairness. Consistency across. It's either going to be treaties everywhere or land claims everywhere. There's nothing in between. And obviously Canada wants it to be land claims because why? These representations that Canada's owns everything and controls everything through its constitutional monarch. That is not the reality, but that is what Indigenous nationals are being tricked into doing. And it's tragic because it's just tragic. Because instead of, under these treaties, and I'm just quoting something from a biography on Thomas Jefferson, and this, armies that could liberate and protect could also conquer and subjugate. Canada is supposed to be, under its obligations of treaty, protecting. Instead, there's this covert effort, this collusion to convert collective assets, to obtain subjugation and capitulation. And the Indigenous people have simply said, look, we just want a strong relationship with the Crown. You know, those relationships even referenced back to when Thomas Jefferson, for example, spoke about, the relations with Indian tribes. They went to revolution in the States because they didn't like the deals done by the Crown. Well, we haven't had a revolution in Canada. That means the Crown is still bound by these treaties. And we are obligated as Canadians to understand that our governments are acting contrary to treaty. They are acting and spending billions of dollars of public money to try to facilitate this capitulation, which is totally unnecessary. I'm going to leave it at that for now because I know it's a bigger chunk than we had intended. I'm hoping to keep these presentations short. But I will be continuing on this one, and although there's probably a few questions, please feel free to convey those questions, and I will attempt to address them. And then once I've covered this topic a little more in depth next time, I'll move into the 50 or so important areas to better understand how these continuing efforts to colonize, these continuing efforts to terminate, how they're affecting you today. And I hope I can help that way. And that's all I have to say for now.